as has already been said this morning, we are coming into land with this Holy Habits series. But we are by no means leaving the habits behind, okay? This has been the introduction to habits that are going to become core to the life of our church and hopefully core to each of our lives. And the passage that Caroline launched our series with was in Ezekiel 47, and it's this prophetic vision that Ezekiel has of a river. You can follow the portions that are on. It's a sort of a summary there. I've taken some bits off just to abbreviate it, but from the beginning of chapter 47, the man brought me back, me being Ezekiel, back to the entrance to the temple, and I saw water coming out from under the threshold of the temple toward the east. The water was coming down from under the south side of the temple, the south altar. And what he does is he follows this man, and this man measures out what he calls 1,000 cubits. And then he talks about after him measuring out 1,000 cubits, the water is ankle deep. And then he measures out another 1,000 cubits, and the water is then knee deep. And he measures out another 1,000 cubits, by then it's at his waist, and after 1,000, it's deep enough to swim in. In fact, in verse 5, a river no one could cross. And he says to me, "Son of man, do you see this?" Love that bit. And then we go on into 6 and 7, where there's this idea of the life of the river flowing into salt water and bringing freshness. When it empties into the sea, the salty water there becomes fresh. And then further down, so where the river flows, everything will live. Fruit trees of all kinds will grow. Their leaves don't wither, and their fruit doesn't fail, and the fruit will serve for food, and the leaves for healing. It's an amazingly life-giving and inspiring image. If you're quick with your Bible, turn to Psalm 1, because this river is not that reference to river in Ezekiel's not the only river. In fact, in Genesis we come across a river, and where else? In Revelation, right at the end, there is a river. There is this life-giving idea of river. But here, smack in the middle, with the beginning of the Psalter in Psalm 1, we have a river. Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers. This is the image of the life that God calls us to. We are called to be like a tree planted by streams of water that never withers. Even though we are dying. I know, it's depressing. But, from the time you're about 24, 25, it's a slide downwards. You just begin to age, don't you? And he said, there's no much sign of me not withering. I'm withering. Yeah, you may be withering on the outside, but there is an inner man that is not withering. There's an inner man that is becoming renewed day by day, Corinthians says. Yeah, I know. Renewed day by day to completion, to what God calls perfection. That's it. Some of you are smiling back at me, and that's what I want. So, how we become a more non-anxious and content and peaceful and loving and happy people. How do we become more at ease? How do we mature? By being in the river, by having our feet in the river, by swimming in the river, if we go over the Ezekiel passage. The idea is a sustained connection with God. And we find it in John 15 too. If you look at John 15, and we're going to look at this idea of a trellis and a vine, the branch remaining in the vine. It says, abide, remain, live from this passage. That passage, it means stay with me, stay connected, a sustained connection with God. And so, what we've done, slide 6, is we've looked at scripture, prayer, worship, retreat, community, witness, and generosity. And we have smashed it. We are done, aren't we? Next slide, please, Bruce. We have sorted it. Okay? If you were unsure about how to meditate on Scripture 7 or 8 weeks ago when Dan preached, now you know, and you've all been doing it every week. Some of you, every day since. Maybe not. Maybe not. And so what we're going to do is we're going to come to, in fact, somebody emailed Caroline and I last week and said, could I have a copy of all the habits and all the hints that you've given me for the last 7 weeks? And we'd already thought, yeah, we need to gather this together in one place. That's why you've got that. You meant to keep it and refer to it. Because even though you've had a whole 6 days between each of these habits, we really don't expect, and we ourselves would say, we've by no means cracked them all in this very short series. So we want to just take some time to look at something that will help us in that. So we live in a distracting world, in case you hadn't noticed. Many of us have very full lives, and those of us who don't have such full lives still can have highly distracted lives. And our world invites us to live faster and faster and faster, to fit more and more and more in to our day, to our week. This challenge may feel modern, but it's actually not modern, because the solution we're going to look at today is a really ancient solution. It's not a modern idea that addresses the digital age. It's actually an ancient solution. It probably dates to St. Patrick and the Celts, so way, way back, but we know for sure that it was formalized by St. Benedict. He wrote it down in the 500s, 527 AD in Italy. He formalized this thing called a rule of life. Now, some of you go, don't like rules. Oh, I love rules. Oh, love a good rule. But some of us don't really like rules. And I want us to just to first of all understand, this is not rules for life. It's not a list of do's and don'ts, okay? The idea, the word rule comes from regula, which is where we got the word regulation, okay? So some kind of regulation in your life, some kind of pattern in your life, sustaining pattern, okay? Might seem boring, but believe me, you all have a pattern. So the trellis in the vineyard is another way of understanding this idea of a rule. And that's Kat's little representation of a trellis there with a vine growing up it. And the idea here is that the vine without the trellis just goes wild along the ground. And it's going to produce far less fruit when it's on the ground to what the abundance that it can produce if it's suspended on a trellis. And the fruit it does produce is going to be vulnerable to animals. So in the same way, we think, and I think many of you will agree, we need a structure to abide in the vine, to create space for God in our lives. So what is a rule of life? And that's sort of some ideas, some words that will help you to understand what a rule of life is, okay? It's a set of practices. It's a set of habits. It's something that creates space rather than fills space. It's a relational thing. It has relational rhythms, and it's based much more on there. Success and failure is not the idea. It's based on relational rhythms in our lives. Somebody called it a set of practices to guard our habits and guide our lives. A pattern, a rhythm to produce greater fruitfulness. And it embraces all of life. Now, that's one of the twists this morning. We've looked at 7 holy habits. But what I'm going to ask you today to do is encapsulate your whole life. Look at your whole life. And the rule of life includes the whole life. It's not just when do I pray and when do I read scripture and when do I rest or retreat, but indeed everything that we do and how it can make space for God. So these are the things that it's not. It's not inflexible. It's not handed down by an external source. Callan and I haven't sat in a darkened room and designed your rule of life. We're just going to hand it to you and you're just going to go away and do it like an automaton. It's designed by you, self-generated. It's not one size fits all. Every single one of you will have a completely unique rule of life. And it's by no means permanent. We would tweak it and we'd change it, although I'd say we do need to sit with it in a sustained way to really see if it's working for us before we start changing it. So I wouldn't say you change it every week. So what I'm going to do now, we're going to take a break and we're going to use the ugly handout, first of all, the Gill handout. And this is really just to give you 5 minutes to start an audit. You're going to do a little life audit. And you can do it as lightly or as intensely as you want to. If you want to start it in a very serious way, I'm only going to give you 5 minutes, so you'll come back to it later. You might just want to scribble some things in a light way. But this is to help us think about our 168 hours. Weirdly, who of you know Nikki and Matt Watts? They didn't have 168 hours in this week because they sailed across the international date line and they had 2 Wednesdays. Isn't that weird? And so for once in their lives, they didn't have 168 hours. But everybody else in this room has had 168 hours since you were here last week, if you were here last week, okay? We only ever get that. And in reality, you've probably slept for 56 of them, something like that. So with the remaining hours, what have you done? And you can put sleep in there, because actually that's part of our rule of life, sleep. If you've got the gift of it, be grateful. So what work have you done? Unpaid, paid, what leisure, fun, family, friends? You can ignore some of the categories. It's really just, what have you done in the last 7 days? If you've been on holiday, probably try and think of a more typical week. And just write down, what have you done and how many hours you think you spent doing it. And I've got phone there. And that's because, this is terrifying. If you are an iPhone user, then if you swipe right a couple of times, fortunately none of you will be able to see what my screen says, it'll tell you how many minutes you've spent on your phone and what you've been doing on your phone. And if you click on it, you can actually get it to tell you what you've done all week. Oh, it's terrifying. So that's why I've put phone at the bottom. You might not be a doom scroller, and if you're not, then you can ignore that. But I'm going to give you 5 minutes to fill this in, just quietly on your own. I'm not going to ask you to share it with anybody. I'm not going to be passing the mic round, so just feel free to write what helps. Music, Jane, that we could play just some gentle music so that we don't hear our brains crunching. Great. Now, I realise that's a very short amount of time. And for some of you, it's a bit of a deadening task. You don't particularly like doing that kind of thing. But if you've enjoyed it and you've begun to get into it, then by all means, take it home and work on it a little bit more. This is step 1 of developing a rule of life. And I'll come back to step 2 in a minute. So we've got to understand that we've got a cultural attitude against rules that is generally around the idea that rules are bad for us, that they're rather constricting, and that they limit rather than provide freedom. But the reality is that most of us do crave some kind of a sense of order in our lives. If we have too little structure, if we have too much choice, the research has proven conclusively that it creates anxiety for us. I remember having a very graphic experience of this when I came home from Brazil, because I lived in Brazil for 6 years, and there's a very strong cultural norm to eat rice and beans. And so when you go into the supermarket, there is an entire aisle of rice and an entire aisle of beans. And I remember one of the things I missed the most, look at that, was jam. I really love jam, and it was quite difficult to buy good quality jam. And often there was maybe only 2 jars to choose from. And so after 6 years, I didn't miss jam anymore. I just bought the jam that was available, and I ate it, and I was grateful for it. But when I moved home, I went to Tesco or Sainsbury's or somewhere, and I walked into the jam aisle, and my limbic system just went off the... it just took a massive spike, because there was about 150 jars of jam, and every flavour and every brand, and of course there's all different sugar contents and fruit contents, and I was kind of, and I needed somebody to come along and say, there you are, Gill, just take that. Just remove the choice. And that sometimes we think choice is a great thing, but it can actually produce a lot of anxiety. The rule of life offers us a sense of order in our lives. And it reminded me, there's a picture on my desk upstairs, and it's verses from Dear Lord and Father of Mankind, and it's got that lovely sentence, take from our lives the strain and stress, and let our ordered lives confess the beauty of thy peace. Margaret Gunther is a spiritual writer. She describes a rule of life as this: a good rule can set us free to be our true and best selves. It's a working document, a kind of spiritual budget, not carved in stone but subject to regular review and revision. It should support us but never constrict us. Now, I liked the idea of a spiritual budget. I don't know if you warm to that idea, but I really like that idea. I've got 168 hours. I reckon about 56 of them I sleep for. And so that leaves me with 110-ish hours, which immediately feels limiting. And that's one of the things about the rule. It helps us to embrace our limitedness. What are you spending your budget on? Is your day arranged with the aim of experiencing the deep joy of Jesus? And some of you might be thinking, I don't really like the sound of this. But the reality is you've got a rule already. We've all got a rule already. I could ask you to put up your hands. Who brushed their teeth this morning? Who had a cup of coffee? Who also had a cup of coffee yesterday? Well, I always have a cup of coffee. Exactly. That's your rule of life. That's your rule of life. Everything, all habits that we repeat, they are our rule of life. And for many of us, it's an unintentional rule of life, isn't it? It's not something we've planned. It's certainly not something most of us have written down. And some of us may not even be all that aware of it. Why are you doing that? Well, I always do that, is the answer. Is it conscious? So, do you know what your rule is? This has begun to show you what your rule of life is. But more importantly, do you know what your rule is doing to you? Do you know what your rule of life is doing to you? Because it's doing something. Now, you would have much less problem with the idea that if I go to the gym, I go 3 times a week, I run, and I lift weights. And nobody would argue that that will do something to me. But everything we do does something to us. Everything has a spiritual impact on us. It makes us more free, or it makes us more enslaved. So your system, your rule, your pattern, your habit of living is perfectly designed to give you the results that you're getting. I think that's Stephen Covey, but I don't know. If you know who it is, let me know. So I want to offer some best practice, and these are based on the postures that Caroline presented to us last week, which is part of our idea of the holy habits. So I'm just going to go through some of these to give us some, hopefully, freeing guidelines about how to develop a rule of life. The first one was humility, and that is really to keep in mind that a rule of life is a means to an end, okay? I don't want you bringing it along on Sunday and saying, look at my fancy rule of life, it's really impressive, okay? It's not supposed to be beautiful for its sake. It's supposed to take us somewhere. And it's as effective, it is as good as it is effective in taking us into God's presence and helping us to live in a sustained way in his presence. The next thing would be to start small. That's why we've always done the toe paddle and swim with these habits. We need to start where we are. I mean, if your habit is to pray for half an hour 3 times a week, then don't start with 5 minutes. Don't start small, because start where you are and build from there. And then simplicity. This would be a good one for some of us in our characters. We tend to be a bit more general, and this is a time to say what it is specifically you're going to do. So when my kids went off to uni, I thought, well, I'm not one of these mums who feels they need to be in touch every day, and my kids are fairly independent. So the risk is not that I'd be overbearing. My risk is that I would be too absent. And so I decided what I'll do is I'll just send them a little voice note once a week, say, here's my news, what's happening with you, what's happening with the boyfriend, the girlfriend, the studies, the life, are you feeding yourself, you remembering to eat, all that kind of thing. And what's happened is that specific intention has produced a little habit, and they answer! Yay! It takes some time sometimes, but they do answer. So not I should keep in touch with my kids, but how exactly am I going to keep in touch with my kids? I'm going to send them a voice note on a Monday morning. And then the next one is, back. Subtract, not add. Now, this we've said over and over again through the Holy Habits series. Most of us need to take something away before we add something in. And most of us need to prioritize rest more than we need to prioritize activity. You will know if you're that person, okay? But we need to build in, most of us, a bit of rest, a bit of margin, a bit of unstructured time. Val and Dan, if they were here, because they've been living with me for 2 years, they would be laughing so loudly right now when I'm telling you to build in unstructured time. Because I'm time for stillness, time for solitude. So, if you've already got an overbusy life, make sure that your rule of life is not just adding stuff, but subtracting. Then discernment was the third one, to take into account our season of life. So this is, discernment, Caroline said, was about us, how we make decisions and understanding that God has desires for us. And God has a desire for us to have a healthy rhythm, but he's not expecting it to look the same as it would have done 10 years ago, or that it would look in 10 years' time. Okay, I remember having a spiritual director when I was when the kids were tiny, and I remember her. She was an 85-year-old nun. She was an amazing woman. And there was one day she looked at me and she said, "Jill, explain to me why it's so important to pray in the early morning when you have a daughter who wakens at 5." And I remember kind of looking at her, and I said, "Well, Jesus prayed," and I didn't even finish the sentence. And she smiled, and we both realized Jesus never had a daughter who woke at 5. But I had this obsession that's what, and my season of life, early morning prayer was not a good idea. So we've got to look at our season of life, our stage of discipleship, how mature we are in Christ, and not push ourselves beyond the point that we're actually at. Our personality, rest for an extrovert, is going to be people. It's going to be excitement, it's going to be animation, it's going to be out and about. Rest for an introvert is going to be solitude. It's going to be shutting the door and having a bit of quiet. So we've got to understand our personalities and discerning all parts of our lives. That's why I've tried to do that really broadly. What's your rhythm of sleep? When do you eat? Do you eat well? I mean, do you drink enough water? That's part of your rule of life, all of that. Self-care. So, and then creativity comes in beautifully into a rule of life because there is no right way. So that's great. You can come and show Cal and I your rule of life, and we're going to go, yay! Because there's no right way. You're going to find your way, the thing that works for you. And you can do that any old way you like. You can paint your rule of life if you don't want to write a list. I mean, I think, why would anybody not write a list? I love a list. But I'd be scared to try and paint it. You could sing your rule of life. You could make up a song or a poem that it encapsulates your rule of life. It's a beautiful expression of your creativity. And then your creativity comes in when you find it's not working and it feels constricting or it feels like it's pressing you too much. You need to revise it and use creative thinking to think, well, how do I move this around so that this discipline, this habit is still here, but it doesn't feel like turgid and hard work like it's feeling. Okay, so those are just some best practices. And what I'm going to do now is something that's going to be a bit of talking and not writing. And that is to just turn to the people next to you. I think there is a slide for it, Bruce. And just tell your stories of your experiences here with these habits. What have you tried, failed or succeeded? And what do you aspire to? As you say, some of you have been saying, oh, we need this gathered together. You must be thinking you want to revisit it. So just chat to the people round about you for 2 or 3 minutes, tell your stories, and talk about your aspirations. Literally, 3 minutes will take. Hello, hello. Good. Now, I'm not going to ask anybody to tell a story, but who's just heard a good one? Who's just heard a good story from somebody? Okay, so the challenge next week, are you ready for this, is you bring the sermon. You think I'm joking? I'm not joking. Nobody's preaching, are they? Nobody's preaching next week. Okay, there's no preacher. And I'm not joking, I'm dead serious. There's no preacher. What is going to be taking the space of the sermon next week is the stories you've just told. Okay? Our stories of success in our developing of holy habits, our unmitigated failures, which will encourage people far more probably than your stories of success. So if you come along and say, I decided to have a Sabbath and it lasted 10 minutes, that kind of thing. We want all those stories, but we want loads and loads and loads of really short stories. Okay, so please don't come with a 10-minute explanation of what you've done, because we've only got about 25 minutes. Okay, so please come along ready to tell your stories next week of all your holy habits experiences. And just in the last slide there, I think it's number 18, Bruce, a few little hints to get you started, because I'm hoping some of you are a bit enthused and you're thinking, yeah, I'm going to have a little go at this. So you've begun. Step 1, we've already begun. That's the audit that you've already started. So you can work on that a bit more if you want to, or just work with what you've done. And then it's what's most important. So if you've ever done any long walking or anything, you've carried a rucksack, you need to think about it that way. What are the absolute non-negotiables in my life, like sleep and eating, right? Get those in there, make sure you've got time for those. And then what else? And this is a prayerful exercise, okay? It's not just like, a cold exercise. You do this with Jesus. And then try it out for a few weeks and edit it and then commit to it for a period of at least 3 months. And I'm going to send to the small group leaders a list of loads and loads and loads of things that you can put into your rule of life. You can choose on self-care things and like prayer and all those kind of things. So have a go with it as small groups maybe. It'd be a good corporate thing to do in your small groups if that is something that serves. Or get people to do it at home and come and compare notes. All right? So that's me finished. Very practical this morning. Thank you for listening and participating so well. And Gail is going to take us on with a bit more worship now. Bless you.